Welcome back to Secret Weapons. My name is Mark Johnston, and we are taking a look at the Walrus Audio Fable today. This is a really cool video to be doing because it is a kind of return to form for me in a lot of ways. We covered the Walrus Audio lore last year, and it was a great opportunity to really dig back into my kind of ambient roots. And we've done a lot of like heavier music on this channel recently, and so opportunities to kind of engage in that ambient world are really wonderful, and the Fable is a great opportunity to do that. We're going to really dig into the intricacies and all of the controls inside of Fable in a really meaningful way today. I hope you find it incredibly useful, and if you do, if you could make sure that you are subscribed to this channel or hit that like button down below. I hate doing the awkward call to action thing. I try not to do it on this channel a lot, but I am aware that it will help grow this channel and give me more opportunities to cover gear in depth like this. So if you like what you're seeing here, if this channel is useful to you, help me out. I'd really appreciate it. Let's get into it. Last year on this channel, we covered the lore, this fascinating new kind of design concept from Walrus Audio. It is a mono but dual DSP ambient workhorse, featuring unified controls for mix modulation, tone, and kind of for time, but with separate regeneration rates for two different ambient effects in series. This is an interesting follow-up to the Fable, because Fable obviously trafficked in a lot of reverse effects, reverse delays, reverse reverbs cascading into one another in ways that kind of had a lot of promise, but often found me hoping for separate mix controls for delay and reverb into one another. The Fable kind of solves for a lot of that, not by changing a mix approach, but by combining two effects that I think are just a little bit more well-suited to one another in terms of like sharing a mix control, a mod control, a tone control, that kind of thing. And what we're dealing with here is delay lines and granular delay. So you are dealing with a lot of a delay line feeding into a granular engine and then kind of like feeding back and forth into each other forever. And the result in Fable is really striking. Fable has 5 programs, and they're all pretty striking, not just in terms of their uniqueness from one another within this pedal, but also as an effect on my pedal board. We're dealing with things like a reverse delay into reverse grains, a analog delay into half-speed granular delay, cascading octave ups, but with great tone and modulation controls to give you exactly the kind of octave up you want and nothing you don't. For those of you who know, I have a long time feud with the concept of cascading octave up effects, and this thing solves for that in a way that I wish more companies knew how to find. Mode 4 in this thing ends up being a strikingly good reverb just in terms of it being 2 multi-tap granular delays in series, feeding back and forth to one another in a way that really creates an entirely new texture and plays uniquely with the time control on this thing, unlike anything else in the pedal does. Mode 5 is of course going to be a standout mode in this thing. Delay into a randomized granular engine that switches between speeds and directions for your grains in ways that offer up incredibly unique textures. The Fable ends up being a really phenomenal pedal for kind of being the inflection point for your stereo wet effects down the road, but it also does a great job as a standalone wet effect. This is not something that kind of like is there to service other things. This can be a really strong ambient tool all on its own. And that's a hard thing for a mono wet effect to do, in my opinion. But I think the most striking thing here is how well implemented the granular delay stuff is. Granular delay is one of those things that in concept I should love across the board. That kind of glitchy ambient thing is so in my wheelhouse in theory, but it's so often not implemented in any way that I can find strikingly useful. Often the grains are too sharp or skittery. They kind of sound overly busy in ways that I don't love. I wish there was a way to smear them or smooth them or get more predictably big or small grains. And the Fable actually takes a really unique approach to solving these problems. The tone control and modulation do a ton to blur the lines of your grains in really meaningful ways. And the secret sauce of this pedal is the fact that your time control not only controls your delay time, but also the size of the buffer that the granular delay pulls from, while the X control determines the size of the grains from that buffer. You basically have two different stages of grain size selection, and I find that to be so incredibly useful. I hope that concept's making sense. When we get to our sound samples, we are going to really dig into basically every single parameter across the top of this thing and try to unpack exactly what each of them bring to the table in terms of building your own idealized granular effect inside of Fable. And I think that once you really get a handle on things like the interactivity between time and X, it really unlocks kind of a strong understanding of how to take something like Fable and get exactly what you want out of it. So let's stop talking, let's go to our pedal board, and let's really dig into Fable. As always, before we get into our sound samples, let's go ahead and talk through our signal chain and the context we are working in. I am playing my Jennings Navigator with Lambertone Crema pickups into the Origin Effects Cali 76, the Benson Germanium Boost, the Benson Preamp, the Walrus Audio Julia Chorus, the Fable, and then into the Timeline and Bigsky, both in stereo, into a stereo pair of amplifiers being the Universal Audio Dream and Ruby. So basically a 80-20 blend of an AC30 and a Fender style amplifier. Throughout the course of this, we will be using basically just the Germanium Boost ahead of the Fable. We're not using the compressor. We're probably not going to touch the preamp for this. We'll bring the Julia in and out. We're currently using no Strymon delay or reverb, but we will bring them in for some specific use cases as we dig into this. But here at the outset, Germanium Boost into the amplifiers. Here's my clean tone. So let's get into the Fable. I find that granular stuff kind of is obvious in what its use case is, that kind of glitchy, stuttery, ambient thing. But a lot of times the process to get to a sound you want can be a little weird. A pedal that traffics in granular can be pretty inscrutable in a lot of ways. So we're going to take this and really kind of like cut it down to its bare components first, and then we'll start walking through the programs just so that we have a handle on what all 8 of these knobs do. We're going to start off with the obvious one, which is just going to be mix from full dry to full wet. I'm glad this thing goes full wet, and I'm also glad that the dry taper doesn't die off until the very, very top, which is really helpful. I mean, you can hear right there, like, even if you keep this thing low enough that it's not really doing a ton of like really, hyper present, like that gets really overbearing, but like even really low mix levels. That little bit of shake underneath it's really cool. But yeah, this thing will get really wet. And again, like I said, I appreciate kind of like it keeps your dry tone up until around 3 o'clock. To kind of help continue to kind of dial that in, like I said, there's some really great stuff at lower mix settings, a little bit more of the Fable as a subtle supporting character, as opposed to the way that I use something like this frequently, which is like the generation point for things like the Timeline. But the benefit of being able to kind of like dial in really subtle stuff is not lost on me. And that tone control is incredibly helpful because it's basically a high roll off. So you've got, let's turn up our everything really quick. Yeah, super useful for being able to really kind of dial in the exact amount of kind of subtlety and darkness you want in a granular thing. Because like I said, granular can be really glitchy and kind of overbearing in a mix if you're not careful. And so being able to kind of like roll off some of that treble makes it instantly useful, which is really great. Next up, let's take a look at that modulation control, which is going to add a little bit of extra movement in here. We've got it down at the bottom right now because that extra movement can kind of like, blur the lines, everything. But these two together really do a lot to kind of help create the right amount of movement and subtlety in your granular setup. I don't know if this is confirmed or not, but I have a sneaking suspicion. I probably should have asked somebody at Walrus Audio about this. That modulation sounds like it's pulled from one of the modulation modes in the Slotva, which I am a really big fan of. Like it feels like it has that dive effect that that the kind of dream mode in the Slotva was so good for. And we're back to normal. So this time control is fascinating here because it doesn't just control the time for the delay itself. For the record, feedback and regen are basically DSP1, DSP2. And for most of the modes, this is going to be some sort of delay and this will be some sort of granular. So time will control both of the speed of the delay time, but it will also control the size of the buffer that the granular side is sampling from. And then the X in turn determines how big of grains are pulled from those samples. I hope that makes sense. So basically, you've got your delay time. Okay, let's bring both these down so we can get a little bit better handle on it. So you've got your short delay times, all the way down to kind of your max delay time. And then on the other side of that, let's bring both these up a little bit. This X control for almost all the modes is going to control, like I said, the size of the grains that you're actually getting. So this is giving you your kind of maximum buffer size to pull grains from, and this is deciding how big of a grain is being sampled from there. So you can hear we're getting a pretty smooth sounding thing. This program one is reverse delay into reverse granular. So you're going to hear things kind of skitter back and forth, but with lower regen mode settings on this mode, you're going to get less of a jumbled thing. But you can hear, if we turn this up, it starts to skitter a little bit more because we're giving it a smaller buffer size to pull from. And then as we increase X, we are shortening the actual grain sample size. So you can hear that. You get smoother, longer, both delay settings and grain samples with that X at minimum and that time at maximum. as you bring that up, and then you also have a tap tempo. There we go. Let's go back to that kind of longest, smoothest combination right there as we take a look at our feedback and our regen. Feedback is pretty much always going to be both, or I should say both are essentially amounts of gain in the feedback loop. For those of you who understand how a delay works, it's basically your dry signal looping back inside of a wet path, and the amount of repeats you get is determined by the volume of your feedback of your signal in your feedback path. So anything below unity is going to progressively drop off and get quieter until it goes away. The lower volume those repeats are, the faster it'll dissipate, and anything at or above unity will either repeat forever or will create that runaway oscillation sound where you start overloading the wet loop as you kind of like gain higher and higher and higher and higher. So that's basically what's happening with each of these. You're controlling the gain in DSP A's feedback loop and gain in DSP B's feedback loop. So if we take like regen on all the way down, and that's going to be your granular, your reverse granular in this mode 1, or this program 1, and you take your feedback to maximum, this thing doesn't really do full self-oscillation, which is helpful because it would get really, really jumbled really fast playing with those two gain stages. But you will get a lot of feedback on your delay line and less gain on the regeneration of your granular. You still have that regen because this mix is universal. It's for DSP A and B, so everything is tied together. But you can hear a marked difference in versus if we take the gain on the feedback all the way down and we increase that regen to max. So now we are getting a lot of regeneration on DSP B, which is going to be your granular, and not a lot of regeneration on your delay. You can hear that one of these feels like it's more of a delay and one of them feels like it's more of a granular. And the fun of this pedal is finding out where you want those to kind of blend together. And then from there, you can go super low regen and really small sample size. And so now you're just adding like a little bit of like very micro, like small skitter to your wet path. Or you can really like let that really, really cloudy, weird thing be the maximizing factor here. Which can be cool if you dial that tone back, increase some modulation, and want that to be kind of your ambient bed underneath your playing. Let's increase that feedback a little bit so we get a little more of that delay holding us together. What's what's fascinating there is this is all just the Fable. You take that out and I'm just playing. And then from there, you know, you throw in a delay, like a stereo delay and a stereo reverb to really fill out the space. Okay, so that's going to be all of our control scheme across the top of the pedal. Before we start jumping into these different programs, there's one more thing I want to touch on, which is if you press and hold the tap control, you have this dive bomb option that I really, really am in love with. So let's dial out something like that, and you can play your chord and take it down an octave. Everything goes to halftime. Really cool. And if you press and hold both together, or tap both together, I should say, you can actually reverse that, which I think is also really, really interesting and incredibly useful if you're using some of the programs that have octave down or octave up built into that DSP-B regen, and you don't want to get too high or too low with your sound, which makes it very flexible in a way that I really love. And we're back to the octave down. Super cool. Okay, now that we have what I would consider to be a working understanding of the controls of the pedal. And by the way, they change a little bit from program to program. Let's walk through our programs. So I feel like we've spent enough time in program one. I just want to highlight one more little trick about this one, which is basically because they both reverse, the delay reverses and the granular is also backwards. You're going to get that kind of jumbled back and forth thing really quickly. So yeah, the nice tip is you can bring one of those way down and it will really it'll preserve that reverse sense a little bit more strongly than if you have them both way up and you just get that thing where they just like run back and forth into each other and just kind of like all the grains kind of like bash back and forth, which is really cool. But if you want kind of a smoother reverse thing, a low regen and a lower feedback can be incredibly helpful. You can hear that, like if I just like palm mute a plink, it bounces back and forth really, really quickly versus something like this. Gives you a little bit more of that. And then you can kind of like support that with like a stereo delay afterwards or whatever. Like I said, I really like this kind of thing as the kind of like inciting incident for big stereo effects. And we will touch on that way more in a little bit. Program 2 is going to be delay into octave up. So basically a pretty straightforward digital delay. Let's get that tone all the way up and everything. Oh, let's take the the timeline back out. And so the trick to know on this one is going to be, one, there's a lot of value in that tone control in this mode because you have those octave up grains coming out of the regen side. And because that regen side is going to create that kind of cascading octave effect. If you have it at minimum like I do, you'll minimize that kind of multi-octave kind of climb that a lot of regenerative octave pedals can give you. Whereas if you crank that up, you can hear that you get that kind of, it steps all the way up octave, 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 octave. And so you can mitigate that by, if you don't want it, which I often don't, by lower regen and a little bit of tone roll off so those high octaves kind of just vanish into the filter. And you can create a little bit more of like a skittery effect on that too, which can be really cool for. And one of these modes, like the octave up mode, is a great example of something that I really like to utilize as that kind of, like I said before, inciting incident for big stereo effects. Take that and then put it into something like Strymon's Auto Swell, my favorite mode in the timeline. And then into a big reverb. Rather than just like a standard octave pedal or a like reverb shimmer, which no one ever likes reverb shimmer, so let's not even talk about that. This gives you that octave up texture, but presents it in some kind of like almost like hearing little like flitters of piano coming through the mist, which is really cool, especially with a little bit of modulation added in there. When in reality, this is what we're hearing. Really cool, really, really cool. And like I said, I love being able to kind of use that tone in conjunction with that regen and that X to create exactly the amount of octave up, the exact brightness of octave up, and the exact amount of cascading that I want out of that octave up, which is something that not a lot of granular or regenerative pitch pedals offer you, which is really nice. Let's jump on up to mode 3. This is another one of those ones that, I mean, we're going to say this 1,000 more times. I have a feeling. Another one of those ones that I like to consider like the inciting incident for our stereo wet effects. This is going to be an analog delay into octave down. The analog delay basically means you're getting a darker, slightly murkier delay repeat instead of that kind of like more crisp digital thing. And then the octave down is going to be a grain played back at half speed. as a method for the octave down rather than being pitched down in some other kind of like polyphonic way. That analog delay benefits pretty heavily from those tone and modulation controls. And because those grains are coming back at half speed, you can actually get a little bit more creative with that X and time kind of combination without sacrificing any smoothness that you might want out of them. And this is also, the grains are also playing back forward just so that we're clear on that, only at half speed. This is a great one to kind of bring that mix back down a little bit. Again, this is a fun one for some of those big swell things if you want something a little bit more menacing and a little bit less pretty. This octave down into a full wet thing like this swell mode on the timeline is very satisfying. Let's jump up onto mode 4. Mode 4 is kind of like the biggest switch up so far in the pedal because this is going to be granular and granular. So both DSP pads in this one are multi-tap granular delays. Let's open up that tone control all the way. Let's kind of like set feedback 1 all the way up here. Let's just kind of go to that kind of smoothest granular set of like options available to us. So maximum time, maximum buffer size and maximum grain size right now. And you're going to hear kind of that just sampled grains being handed back and forth between the two in-series engines. And what's so cool about it being like 2 multi-taps in a row is you very quickly get into kind of like faux reverb territories. Especially if you kind of start to shrink down your buffer and grain sizes. Introduce some modulation, reduce some tone a little bit. and it can get really dusty and let's bring in a stereo tape delay for this one. It's worth noting, we technically have no reverb going on right now. We have this guy into the timeline set to a, for clarity, tape delay. But you bring this in. It's just excellent. It's a really great sounding kind of like faux reverb ambience that you can create inside a program for. And I love how smooth the pitch changes on the time knob are. Let's jump over to program 5. Program 5 is going to be a standard delay into maybe the coolest thing in this pedal, which is going to be that kind of granular delay, but with random speed and pitch. So you've got unity half speed and double speed granules being pulled from here. This X factor actually takes on a new meaning in this context, which is both your grain size relative to your time knob's buffer, but also it's going to be how frequently your grains change in terms of pitch and direction. So lower X factors here are going to be smoother grains with less changes, and then progressively smaller grains with more frequent shifts in pitch and direction. Like I said, you can tap in a faster delay time, and that will, faster delay times equals a smaller buffer being pulled by X, which means smaller overall grain samples, which means more frequent changes as well. But this is a way to kind of keep your delay line where it wants to be while making your changes happen more quickly. So yeah, you can hear as we kind of crank that X knob, we get glitchier granules and more frequent changes. And in that same way, if we maximize that time knob and maximize that X factor, then you get just jumping up and down as fast as they possibly can. Not that you'd want that, but it's an option available to you. This is one of the modes that I think, when I talk about loving smooth granular and being frustrated that not enough pedals do really kind of gentle applications of granular delay, this is a space where I get really excited. Like that really long delay time, or those really infrequent pitch changes and direction changes on that regeneration. about to happen. That swell mode on the timeline into a nice big stereo reverb, and this mode is just kind of like everything you need to make giant sweeping ambience with one pedal, or with one guitar, I should say. And again, what we're really hearing there is you honestly don't even need the timeline. You just throw that into a big reverb.